I'm Ava Monroe, 32 years old, and the day my parents decided to drag me into court was the same day I realized blood meant nothing without loyalty. I hadn't even finished saying goodbye to my grandfather when they showed up with their lawyer, already whispering about assets and family fairness. When I walked into that cold Boston courtroom, my mother didn't even hide her smirk. She leaned back, crossed her legs, and rolled her eyes like she already knew she'd win. But when the judge looked up from his papers, everything stopped. His expression changed, and the next words out of his mouth shifted the ground beneath us all. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand alone when family turned their back on you. I was born into a world of absence. My parents, Lydia and Charles Monroe, left me with my grandparents when I was 3 months old, promising it would only be for a short while. That while turned into a lifetime. My first memories weren't of a mother's perfume or a father's laughter. They were of Evelyn's kitchen. The smell of melted butter, the hum of an old radio, the warmth of her hands guiding mine as I stirred cookie dough that spilled over the bowl. She used to say the best cookies were the messy ones, just like life. I didn't realize then how much she was teaching me about love, that it wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. My grandfather, Judge Henry Parker, was a man of quiet gravity. Every evening he'd come home from the courthouse still wearing his black robe and ask, "What did my favorite lawyer in training learn today?" I'd hold up my crayon drawings, and he'd study them like legal briefs, nodding as if they held real merit. He never spoke loudly, never raised a hand, but his authority filled the room like steady light. It wasn't fear he inspired, it was respect. To him, justice wasn't a theory, it was a way of living. And he practiced it every day, whether he was in court or sitting at our dinner table. For a long time, I thought that was what every family looked like. But when I started school, I began to notice the difference. Other kids had parents sitting in the bleachers at soccer games, waving at plays and snapping photos. I had 2 empty chairs and a grandmother who clapped twice as loud to make up for it. I'd come home pretending it didn't matter, but Evelyn always knew. She'd hand me a warm cookie smile and say, "You're worth showing up for, sweetheart." Back then, I believed her. I had to. The few times Lydia and Charles did appear, it was like a performance. My mother arrived in designer heels, her lipstick flawless, her words polished and empty. My father never even came inside. He stayed in the car honking when it was time to leave. Their visits lasted less than an hour, and the silence they left behind stretched for months. My grandparents never badmouthed them, never said they were selfish or cruel. Henry would only say, "Some people confuse love with convenience, Ava. You'll learn the difference someday." He was right, though I wish I hadn't learned it so young. By the time I turned 10, I'd stopped expecting birthday cards. By 16, I'd stopped pretending they might show up at graduation. The truth was simple. They weren't interested in being parents. They were interested in being admired. Meanwhile, Henry and Evelyn gave me something far rarer than gifts consistency. She taught me tenderness, and he taught me structure. He believed every problem could be solved by looking at the facts, but she reminded me that hearts weren't built like cases. Between them, I grew into someone balanced between warmth and reason, a blend that would one day define my entire life. When I left for college, they stood at the train station waving until I was out of sight. That was love, not grand, not loud, but steady. I called home every Sunday, and Henry never missed a chance to ask what I'd learned that week. He believed education was a promise, not just a path. "The law will show you who people really are," he told me once. "It strips away the performance." I didn't know how true that would become. At the time, I thought he meant criminals, not family. After graduation, I followed in his footsteps and went to law school. My parents sent a brief message. "Good job, proud of you." No visit, no phone call, just a line typed out of obligation. But I didn't need their approval anymore. I had already found what I was searching for: purpose, and a family that had shown me what loyalty looked like. Henry was there at my swearing-in ceremony, his proud smile the only validation that mattered. I built my career one case at a time, guided by his voice in the back of my mind. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about showing up. And for years I believed that showing up was enough, until the day I got the call that Henry was gone. He passed quietly in his sleep, his robe still hanging by the door, his desk still stacked with files he never got to finish. The house felt smaller without him, and every creak in the floor reminded me of the silence he'd left behind. When the will was read a few weeks later, I expected something modest, maybe his books, his gavel, a letter. Instead, the lawyer's voice echoed through the room as he read, "To my granddaughter, Ava Monroe. I leave my estate in its entirety." My parents' faces hardened like stone. They hadn't expected that, and in that instant, I saw something in their eyes I'd never seen before, not guilt, not regret, but calculation. That look would follow me all the way to the courthouse. As I left the office that day, snow began to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, like the world was pausing before what was about to come. I should have felt lucky, but all I felt was unease, because I knew Lydia and Charles, and they weren't done pretending to care. The day the will was read stayed with me, not for what I gained, but for the silence that followed. My parents barely waited for the lawyer to finish before storming out of the office. I watched their car pull away from the curb tires, crunching over the thin layer of snow, and I knew I would hear from them again, not with words, but with paperwork. The quiet that settled afterward was heavy, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays. I drove home to my grandfather's house that evening, still half expecting to hear his voice echo through the hallway, the way it always did when he was deep in thought. But the house didn't sound the same anymore. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and walked into his study. Everything was exactly how he'd left it, the neatly stacked folders, the half-empty mug of coffee on the corner of his desk, the robe draped carefully over the chair. It smelled faintly of cedar and ink. I sat down at his desk, tracing the edge of a photograph framed beside his gavel, one of us taken years ago on my law school graduation day. His arm rested around my shoulders, his smile calm and proud. Beneath it was a handwritten note in his careful script, "Truth is its own defense." For weeks I tried to return to work and move on with routine, but grief doesn't fit into schedules. Every case file blurred together, every courtroom felt smaller. Daniel noticed before I said anything. He started stopping by my office after hours, dropping off coffee, or suggesting we grab dinner just to get me out of the building. "You don't have to prove you're fine," he said one night, leaning against the doorframe. "People who loved you would rather see you rest than see you break." I nodded, grateful, but unable to explain that rest had become a foreign concept. The first letter from my parents arrived about a month after the funeral. It was short, cold, precise, and written by an attorney whose signature I didn't recognize. They were contesting the will, claiming I had taken advantage of my grandfather's declining health. I sat on the edge of my couch, the paper trembling between my fingers. It wasn't just the accusation that stung. It was how predictable it all felt. I'd seen greed before in defendants in courtrooms and strangers, but seeing it in people who shared my last name was something else entirely. When I called Daniel to tell him there was a pause on the other end of the line, "They're suing you." His tone was steady, but I heard the disbelief beneath it. "On what grounds undue influence?" I said quietly. "They're saying I manipulated him." He exhaled slowly. "Ava, I don't even know what to say. They really don't know who they're up against, do they?" That night I drove back to my grandfather's house. I couldn't sleep, and something about that study called to me, maybe instinct, maybe memory. The air was cool and still when I unlocked the door. I walked straight to the desk, pulling open drawers I hadn't opened before. It was there, tucked neatly in a leather folder marked Payments. Inside were decades of records transfers, handwritten notes, receipts, all organized in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. He had documented every dollar he'd ever given my parents, each entry precise and dated. February 2002. Lydia requested an increase to cover expenses. April 2005. Charles's business failed again. As I read through the pages, a pattern took shape. They had taken from him for years hundreds of thousands of dollars, and never once had they looked back. He hadn't been naive. He knew who they were, and still he had kept helping them quietly and without complaint. I stayed there until dawn, surrounded by papers that told the story they were too proud to admit. When the sun rose, it cast a pale light over the desk, and for the first time since his death, I felt calm. Daniel came by the next morning, and when he saw the folder spread across the table, he froze. "You found it," he said. "I think he meant for me to," I replied. He looked down at the record, shaking his head slowly. "They're not going to like what this says." "No," I said, "but that's not my problem anymore." Over the next few weeks, my life turned into a careful rhythm of building and waiting. Daniel and I worked through the documents, gathering witness statements and financial proof. It wasn't hard. Everything was there, perfectly maintained. My grandfather had always believed that the truth didn't need embellishment, only patience. But as the case gained traction, whispers began spreading through the courthouse. Some of my colleagues avoided eye contact, unsure what to believe. I could feel the weight of their silence when I walked past, not cruel, just cautious. One evening, after another long day, I sat alone in my office with only the hum of the city through the window. My computer screen glowed with scanned copies of the lawsuit pages, of accusations dressed as concern, manipulation, exploitation, financial control. They'd turned their neglect into a weapon. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet settle. The walls seemed to echo with my grandfather's voice. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about showing up. That thought steadied me more than anything else. The hearings began quietly, without much attention at first. But as the details of who my grandfather had been came out, his reputation, his legacy, people started to talk. Headlines appeared online, speculation filled local papers, and soon everyone seemed to have an opinion. Lydia and Charles loved that part. They posed for photos outside the courthouse, Lydia clutching a handkerchief she didn't need. Charles staring solemnly at the ground as if he'd been wronged. The irony would have been almost amusing if it hadn't been so cruel. Daniel handled most of the filings, but I refused to sit back and watch. I was there for every deposition, every review of evidence. Each time their lawyer spoke, I saw a version of myself reflected in his words: greedy, manipulative, ungrateful. It was strange, almost surreal, hearing your life rewritten by people who barely lived in it. Yet with every document we submitted, every record we presented, I felt the foundation shifting in my favor. The truth was slow but steady. Late one night, after sorting through another pile of bank statements, I found myself standing by the window of that old house. The city lights blurred in the distance, and I thought about Evelyn's voice from years ago, gentle and sure, spring's worth the wait. Back then she was talking about flowers, but now I understood it was about more than that. Growth takes time, so does justice. As the trial date approached, Daniel stopped by with 2 cups of coffee and a tired grin. "You ready for this?" I nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." He leaned against the counter. "You've done everything right, Ava. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you've already proven who you are." I didn't respond right away. I just looked down at the folders on the table, the evidence, the letters, the years of silence turned into proof. "They wanted to face me," I finally said. "They just don't realize who they raised me to be." The night before the hearing, I barely slept. The house was quiet except for the creak of the old floors and the wind outside the windows. I packed my briefcase carefully, checking every file twice. When I finally closed it, the sound echoed in the stillness like a promise. I stood in front of the mirror, studying the reflection that stared back, steady eyes, calm breath, no trace of the child who used to wait by the window for her parents' car. Tomorrow we would walk into that courtroom, and I would see them again for the first time in years. Not as family, not as daughter or child, but as equals, standing on opposite sides of the law my grandfather had once served so faithfully. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and slow against the glass. It looked peaceful, quiet, deliberate, as if the world itself were holding its breath for what was about to begin. The morning of the trial came cold and pale, the kind of Boston morning where the air stings before the sun finds its strength. I woke before the alarm, already dressed in my mind, long before I reached for my suit. My briefcase waited by the door, each file stacked neatly, each page memorized. Outside, snow traced a thin layer over the street, soft enough to hide the cracks beneath. I watched from the window as the city began to move. Delivery trucks bundled commuters, the hum of ordinary life, and for a moment I envied their simplicity. My world, at least for that day, was measured in silence and cross-examinations. The courthouse sat like a block of marble against the gray sky, tall and cold and familiar. I'd walked those halls for years as a prosecutor, but that morning the building felt foreign, heavier somehow. When Daniel met me on the steps, his breath showed in the air. "Ready?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. "Ready," I said, even though the word didn't feel real. Inside every sound echoed footsteps, murmurs, the rustle of papers, all of it pressing against the space where my calm should have been. When we stepped into the courtroom, the air shifted. My mother sat in the front row, perfectly composed, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek twist. Her lips curved in a polite smile, though her eyes didn't move from her phone. My father sat beside her, hands folded, gaze fixed on the table. Neither of them looked my way. Palmer Reed, their lawyer, leaned against the plaintiff's table, like a man certain of his own charm. I'd seen his type 100 times before, polished, confident, eager to turn a story into theater. Judge Brennan entered promptly at 9. The scrape of chairs, the quiet shuffle of documents, all the tiny sounds that make up a courtroom seemed louder than usual. He glanced over the docket, then looked up. For a brief moment, his eyes lingered on me. Recognition flickering there. I wasn't just another attorney that morning. I was the defendant. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice even. But there was a pause, a slight catch before he continued, as though the scene before him didn't quite make sense. Palmer was first to speak. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and deliberate. "This case is not about greed. It's about justice for a daughter and son-in-law who were wrongfully excluded from a father's estate due to manipulation and emotional control." He gestured toward Lydia, who dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue, a soft, practiced motion. "My clients were denied the chance to reconcile. Their father, once a respected judge, was isolated in his later years by a granddaughter who used his grief for her own gain." I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, not because I was calm, but because stillness was my armor. His words floated through the air, landing like dust on every surface, coating the truth in a thin layer of performance. When he spoke of family bonds, I watched my father's jaw tighten just barely, like he wanted to speak but couldn't. When Palmer finished, Daniel rose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He simply walked to the center of the room and said, "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Judge Henry Parker was of sound mind, deliberate, and fully aware of his decisions. It will also show that for over 2 decades, he provided financial support to the plaintiffs, nearly $800,000 in total." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Lydia's eyes flicked toward me, then back to her hands. "The truth," Daniel continued, "is that his final act was not one of manipulation, but of clarity." Lydia was called first. She stepped to the stand, smoothing her blazer as if every crease carried meaning. Palmer's questions were gentle, almost affectionate. "Mrs. Monroe, how would you describe your relationship with your father?" She took a shallow breath, her voice trembling just enough. "He was everything to me," she said. "After my mother passed, he withdrew. I tried to reach him, but Ava—" She hesitated, glancing toward me. "Ava didn't always make that easy." Palmer nodded sympathetically. "You loved him deeply then." "I still do," she whispered, eyes glistening beneath the courtroom lights. When Daniel stood for cross-examination, the warmth in the room thinned. He held a folder in one hand and spoke with quiet precision. "Mrs. Monroe, you said you visited often after your mother's passing. Can you tell the court how many times Lydia shifted?" "I don't recall the exact number." "Would you say once a month?" "No." "Once a year?" "Sometimes," she said softly. Daniel opened the folder. "Records show 4 visits between 1990 and 2008. Does that sound right?" Her lips pressed together, color draining from her face. "I was busy. I had a family work." And during those years, Daniel interrupted gently. "Your father sent you regular financial support, correct?" Her voice faltered. "He wanted to help." He nodded. "Over $800,000, Mrs. Monroe." "Does that sound like help or dependency?" The question hung in the air. Lydia looked at Palmer, searching for rescue, but he only said, "Objection, too late for it to matter." Judge Brennan simply said, "Overruled." When Charles took the stand, he looked smaller than I remembered. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Palmer asked him a few quick questions about family vacations, shared memories, his relationship with my grandfather. Charles spoke in clipped sentences, eyes darting between me and the floor. It didn't take long before Daniel approached again. "Mr. Monroe, did you attend your daughter's high school graduation?" Charles blinked. "No, I couldn't. We were out of town. Her college graduation." He hesitated. "No. Law school." Another pause. "No." Daniel projected a photograph onto the screen. Me in my cap and gown, my grandfather clapping in the front row, pride written across his face. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. "He showed up," Daniel said quietly. "You didn't." Palmer tried to redirect, painting a picture of my grandfather as frail, confused, susceptible to manipulation. But every document we submitted, medical records, letters, bank statements, said otherwise. Henry Parker had been as sharp as ever until his final days, and his handwriting told the truth better than any witness could. By the time the judge called for a recess, the room felt drained. Lydia and Charles huddled near the window with Palmer, their voices low and urgent. Daniel handed me a bottle of water, and we stepped into the hallway. "You're doing great," he said. "They're running out of lies." I nodded, though my throat was too tight to answer. Through the glass pane of the door, I could see my mother glance over her shoulder at me, a quick look something between fear and fury before she turned away again. When the court resumed, it was my turn. I took the oath, my hands steady as I spoke. Daniel started with the simplest question. "Miss Monroe, can you describe your relationship with Judge Parker?" I looked up at the judge, then at the faces before me. "He raised me," I said. "He taught me the difference between truth and comfort. He believed in showing up even when it was hard." Palmer stood. "Miss Monroe, isn't it true that you benefited financially from this relationship?" "Yes," I said. "He paid for my education, my home, my start in life. So he gave you everything." "No," I said. "He gave me something you can't buy: consistency." For the first time, the room was silent in a way that felt complete. Palmer looked down at his notes, unable to find another question. Daniel handed the judge a sealed letter, my grandfather's final words. Judge Brennan read quietly for a long moment, his eyes softening as he reached the end. When he spoke, his voice carried through the entire room. "The court finds that Judge Parker's will reflects his true and deliberate intentions," he said. "There is no evidence of manipulation, no sign of incompetence." The plaintiff's claim is dismissed. The gavel struck once sharp and final. My mother's breath caught audibly. My father's shoulders sagged. I stood there, the air suddenly lighter around me, the echoes fading into something that almost sounded like peace. When we walked out of the courtroom, Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. I shook my head. "No," I said, "he did. I just showed up." Outside, the wind carried the last of the snow across the courthouse steps. Lydia stood by the railing, her eyes red, her voice small. "Ava, please, can we talk?" I paused, studying her face, the same face that had looked away for years. "About what? I'm your mother." I met her gaze. My mother was Evelyn Parker. I turned toward the street, the sound of my heels clicking against the stone steps, each one lighter than the last. The cold air met my skin sharp and clean, and for the first time in a long while, silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. When the courthouse doors closed behind me, the sound was final, sharp, clean, like the last word in a long argument. Outside, the cold air hit my skin and carried away the noise that still echoed in my ears. For a moment, I stood on the steps, my breath forming small clouds that vanished into the gray sky. Daniel was beside me, but neither of us spoke. The verdict had been clear, and yet the weight of it still lingered. Justice had been served, but family had been lost, though I wasn't sure it had ever really been mine to lose. We walked to his car, the tires crunching through a thin crust of ice. "You sure you don't want to come celebrate with the team tonight?" he asked quietly. "They'd love to see you." I shook my head. "Not tonight." He studied me for a moment before nodding. "Then at least get some sleep. You've earned that much." Sleep, I thought, was for people whose lives fit neatly into endings. Mine didn't. Not yet. That night, the house was silent when I returned. I placed my briefcase on the table, the latch clicking louder than it should have. The old floorboards creaked as I walked down the hallway past framed photos that felt more like witnesses than memories. My grandfather's study door was half open, and the faint scent of cedar still hung in the air. I sat in his chair and let my fingers trace the grain of the desk, the same place I'd once done homework while he reviewed case files beside me. On the shelf above the desk sat the sealed letter he'd written me, now folded neatly inside its envelope. I had read it only once, the night after the will was revealed. His words were simple, his handwriting steady. "You earned this not by blood, but by presence. Never doubt what you've built with honesty." I closed my eyes and could almost hear him saying it. That steady voice had carried me through every uncertain moment. It still did. The next few weeks passed in a strange quiet. The headlines that once blared my name faded, replaced by new scandals and stories. My parents disappeared just as quickly as they'd arrived, retreating from public view. There were no apologies, no calls, only the sound of their absence, the language they had always spoken best. But the silence didn't hurt anymore. It was just space, empty but peaceful. Work returned to its steady rhythm. Courtrooms felt familiar again, their structure comforting in a way home couldn't always be. Daniel stopped by, often checking in under the excuse of needing help with a brief. He didn't have to say why he was really there. One evening, as we stood by the courthouse steps watching the city lights flicker on, he said, "You ever think about taking a break, maybe go somewhere warm for a while?" I smiled faintly. He used to say, "Justice doesn't take vacations." "Henry Parker sounds exhausting," he joked, and I laughed, a real laugh, the first in what felt like months. As winter turned to spring, the house began to change too. I opened the windows again. I cooked dinner without feeling the weight of memory sitting beside me. The garden, the one Evelyn used to tend every morning, bloomed early that year. Tulips pushed through the soil in quiet defiance, and each time I passed them, I thought of her kneeling in the dirt, humming softly, believing that beauty could survive even the coldest seasons. One Saturday morning, I drove out to Mount Auburn Cemetery with a small basket of bulbs and a hand spade. The ground was soft from the rain, and the air smelled faintly of pine. I knelt between the two headstones, Evelyn Parker and Judge Henry Parker, brushing the damp leaves away from their names. "We made it," I said softly. My voice didn't tremble this time. I planted the bulbs in even rows the way she used to, and as I pressed the soil down, I felt the same calm I used to feel in their kitchen all those years ago. I stayed there until the light shifted gold and the air cooled again. When I stood, the garden around their graves looked small but alive, the first hint of color in a sea of gray stone. It wasn't grand or perfect, just real. That was enough. As I walked back to the car, I thought about the case and all the noise it had created. In the end, it hadn't been about money or revenge. It had been about truth, simple, steady, undeniable. The kind of truth my grandfather lived, by the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to them, not to anyone. A few months later, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a check, the exact amount my parents had been ordered to pay in legal fees. There was no note, no apology, just the signature of their attorney. I folded it once, placed it in a drawer, and never cashed it. Some debts can't be paid with money. By the time summer came, the house no longer felt like a museum of grief. I painted the study walls a lighter shade, something soft and warm. Daniel helped move boxes from the attic, and one evening as we packed old files, he found my grandfather's gavel wrapped in a cloth. He held it up, smiling. "You should keep this on your desk." I looked at the worn handle and nodded. Someday. That someday came sooner than I expected. 3 years later, I stood behind a bench carved from polished oak the same way my grandfather once had. The courtroom was different, newer, brighter, but the weight of the robe over my shoulders felt exactly as I had imagined it. My nameplate read, Judge Ava Monroe, the youngest appointed in Massachusetts history. On my first day I arrived early, the courtroom empty and still. I placed the gavel on the desk and let my fingers rest on it for a moment. "We made it, Grandpa," I whispered. The words hung in the air, simple and sure. When the doors opened and the first case began, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. Every decision I made, every sentence I delivered, carried a piece of what they had taught me: fairness, patience, and the courage to listen. Life moved forward in quiet, steady rhythms. I never heard from Lydia or Charles again. Time took care of what words couldn't. The anger faded, replaced by a kind of acceptance, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. People can only give what they know how to give, and some never learn the language of love. Years later, after I retired, I returned to Mount Auburn once more. The tulips had multiplied their colors bright against the grass. I knelt again, brushing the petals aside. "You were right," I said softly. "Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment I could almost hear their laughter again, steady, proud, and close. As I walked back to my car, the evening sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground. The world was quiet, peaceful. Justice had been done, but more than that, life had been lived honestly, fully, and on my own terms. The first year after the trial felt like the slow rebuilding of a house that had burned to the ground. Everything was still standing, the walls, the roof, the foundation, but the air inside was different, quieter. I returned to my cases, filling my days with motions, hearings, and long stretches of solitude. It wasn't loneliness exactly, more like recovery. Daniel still dropped by my office once a week, always with that same crooked smile and a cup of coffee balanced in one hand. He never asked about my parents again, and I never brought them up. Some things were better left sealed behind silence. By late spring, the promotion rumors started. My record was clean, my trial outcomes consistent, and my name had begun circling in conversations I wasn't part of. One morning, the district's chief judge called me into his office. He was an older man, polite but direct. "Monroe," he said, tapping his pen against the desk, "you've got the temperament we need. Ever considered wearing the robe?" The words landed heavier than he probably intended. I sat there speechless for a moment, thinking of my grandfather's study of the way sunlight caught the gold trim on his judge's robe. I heard myself say, "Yes, sir, I have." The application process moved faster than I expected. Within months, I was appointed to the bench youngest in the district, some said in the state. The ceremony was small, held in the same courthouse where I'd once been a defendant. Standing at the front of that room wearing the robe my grandfather had left me, I understood what he meant when he told me justice wasn't about revenge. It was about presence. My first few months on the bench were a test of patience and rhythm. I learned to listen more than speak, to watch the small shifts in people's faces as they told their truths or hid behind half-truths. Each case reminded me of something Henry used to say: "The law is about people, not paper." I kept his gavel on my desk not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of restraint. Megan Collins joined my chambers that summer, fresh from law school, eager and curious. She reminded me of myself at that age, all sharp edges and untamed hope. "Judge Monroe," she said, the first day hands full of case files, "do you ever get used to the silence after you make a ruling?" I smiled. "No, you just learn to live with it." Over time, she became a steady presence, her questions honest and her insight surprising. Working with her made me realize how much teaching had always been part of who I was, something inherited perhaps. Outside the courtroom, life found its small rhythms again. Daniel and I started meeting on Friday evenings, trading courthouse gossip for quiet dinners. He liked to tease me about my new title, saying it made me sound too serious. "Judge Monroe," he'd say with mock formality, raising his glass. "Still prefer coffee to champagne," I assume I'd laugh and shake my head. The friendship between us had become something steady, a kind of chosen family neither of us had expected to find. It was during one of those dinners that the past came knocking again. Daniel's phone buzzed, and he glanced down, his expression tightening. "You might want to see this," he said, sliding it across the table. On the screen was a news headline from a local business paper. "Former Monroe Holdings executives accused of fraud." Beneath it, my parents' names: Lydia and Charles Monroe, listed among those under investigation for financial misconduct. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. They were still running that company. Daniel nodded slowly. Looks like they were using offshore accounts. It's bad, Ava. The restaurant noise faded around me, replaced by the low hum of disbelief. After all these years, after everything, they were still chasing money like it could fix what they'd broken. I didn't say a word for the rest of the meal. That night I couldn't sleep. The headlines ran through my mind on a loop, the same names, the same cycle. I thought about my grandfather's records, those careful notes about the money he'd sent them, how he'd known they'd never stop taking. He'd seen this coming long before I did. Still, part of me wished he hadn't been right. A few days later, a letter arrived at the courthouse addressed to my chambers. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. I opened it, expecting another thank you note from a past defendant, something that happened more often than people thought. But when I unfolded the paper, I saw her name at the bottom. Lydia Monroe. The letter was brief, almost brittle. She wrote that she and Charles were under federal investigation and had lost nearly everything. She said she was living in a rented apartment outside Hartford and that she didn't know where else to turn. There was no apology, no mention of the trial, no acknowledgement of the years between us, just a quiet, desperate request. Please, call me. I read the note twice, then folded it neatly back into the envelope. For a moment I considered it picking up the phone, asking the questions that had haunted me my entire life. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. Some wounds don't need reopening. I placed the envelope in my drawer beside the uncashed check she'd once sent through her attorney, two relics of a relationship that had never really existed. Days later, Daniel found me in my office after hours, the lights low, the letter still sitting on my desk. "You're not going to answer, are you?" he asked quietly. "No," I said. "There's nothing left to say." He nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "For what it's worth, I think Henry would be proud of you." I looked at the gavel on my desk and smiled faintly. I think he already knows. Fall came early that year, the air crisp and the courthouse steps covered in leaves. One afternoon, as Megan and I left for the day, she stopped at the door. "Judge Monroe," she said, "I just wanted to thank you for trusting me. I've learned more here than I ever did in school." Her sincerity caught me off guard. "You'll do fine on your own," I said. "Just remember the law shows who people really are. Let it teach you, not harden you." She smiled, and for the first time I heard my grandfather's tone in my own words. That evening I drove home as the sun dipped low, streaking the sky in soft orange. The house glowed warmly from the street, the garden alive with color again. I stood by the tulips Evelyn had once planted their petals, closing in the cool air, and realized something simple. Endings aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet, the slow closing of doors, the fading of voices, the settling of peace where chaos used to live. Inside the house felt steady and lived in. I poured a cup of tea, sat by the window, and let the day unwind. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine, the same scent that once filled my grandfather's study. Somewhere in that silence I felt his presence again, calm, patient, proud. The kind of love that doesn't demand, doesn't fade, just stays. The first time I saw their names in an official report, it felt like déjà vu, the same sharp ache that used to follow every phone call, every court notice, every time their choices spilled into my life. This time, though, it wasn't a family matter. It was federal. Lydia and Charles Monroe were under investigation for wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. The same people who once accused me of manipulation were now accused of stealing from their own investors. The file landed on my desk by coincidence. It had been circulated through the court system for review, part of a larger caseload, and someone had assigned it to my docket by mistake. When I opened it, their names jumped off the page. Lydia Monroe. Charles Monroe. The handwriting on the signature line was unmistakable. I froze. Megan, who had been sorting through case summaries beside me, noticed the change in my expression. "Everything all right, Judge Monroe?" she asked softly. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, just a familiar name. That afternoon, I called the clerk's office and had the case reassigned. It wasn't my place to oversee it. But even after it left my docket, I couldn't shake the unease. Their actions had finally caught up with them, not through me, not through any confrontation, but through the very system my grandfather devoted his life to. Justice had arrived on its own clock, just as he always said it would. A few days later, Daniel appeared in my office holding a folder. "You've seen it?" he asked. I nodded. "It was bound to happen," he said quietly. "They've been living on borrowed time for years." He hesitated before adding, "Federal investigator's name is Eric Dawson." "Good man. If you want updates, I can ask him." I shook my head. "No need. Whatever happens, it's not my fight anymore." Still, I could tell from his expression he didn't quite believe me. The weeks that followed felt strangely hollow. Every headline that mentioned their names tugged at something in me, not pity, not anger, just an old echo of what might have been. The newspaper called it a high-profile collapse, but to me, it was just another ending. I'd built a life far from theirs, one defined by purpose, not performance. Yet some part of me still wished they'd learned before it was too late. Megan noticed my quiet distraction. One morning, she placed a cup of coffee on my desk and said, "You don't talk about your family much." I looked up, caught off guard. "Not much to talk about." She smiled gently. "Fair enough. I just figured since you're always helping everyone else, maybe someone should ask how you're doing for once." Her sincerity softened something I hadn't realized was tense. "I'm all right, Megan," I said. "Some stories just end sooner than we expect." That afternoon, as I prepared to leave, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice that greeted me wasn't. "Judge Monroe," a man asked. "This is Eric Dawson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I understand you're related to two of our current defendants, Lydia and Charles Monroe." I straightened in my chair. "They're my parents, yes. I thought you should know they're entering a plea deal," he said. "Lydia's attorney requested that I reach out. She asked if you'd be willing to provide a character statement to the court." For a moment, the air in the room seemed to thin. "A character statement," I repeated. "That's right," Dawson said carefully. "It could help mitigate her sentence." I exhaled slowly. "No, I won't be doing that." He paused. "Understood. For what it's worth, I didn't think you would." His tone was respectful, not judgmental. "She wanted me to give you her number in case you changed your mind." "Please don't," I said quietly. "There's nothing left to discuss." When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across my desk. Later that evening, I walked through the empty courthouse. The echo of my footsteps followed me down the corridor, the same path I'd walked years earlier on the day my parents had tried to take everything from me. The air smelled faintly of floor polish and old wood. In the quiet, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again. "Justice isn't about revenge, Ava. It's about showing up." That night I stopped by the cemetery. The sky was overcast, the air damp and cold. I knelt beside their graves, Evelyn's and Henry's, brushing away the leaves that had gathered there. "It's done," I whispered. "They've finally run out of ways to pretend." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint rustle of branches. It wasn't comfort I felt, but clarity. Some stories close, not with triumph, but with peace. Over the following months, I watched from a distance as the case unfolded. News outlets reported plea agreements and restitution deals. My parents' home was sold, their assets liquidated. They avoided prison, but their reputation was gone. The people who once smiled for their attention now crossed the street to avoid them. It wasn't vengeance. It was truth stripped bare. Megan brought in the morning paper one day and hesitated before placing it on my desk. "You probably don't want to see this," she said softly. I nodded for her to leave it anyway. The headline read, "Monroe couple declared insolvent after fraud conviction." I stared at the photo, Lydia's face pale and drawn, Charles's eyes downcast. For the first time, I didn't feel the sting of recognition. They were just people now, strangers caught in the consequences of their own choices. That evening, Daniel stopped by with takeout. "You've been quiet," he said. "Even for you." I smiled faintly. "I think I'm just finished with it." "Finished?" "Yes," I said. "There's nothing left to fix." We ate in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need words. When he left, I walked out to the garden. The tulips were fading, their petals curling toward the earth. I knelt to cut a few of the stems and placed them in a vase inside the house. As I set them by the window, I thought about Evelyn's hands pressing the soil, about Henry's steady voice guiding every decision I'd ever made. They had built me to withstand storms like this, and I finally understood that surviving wasn't the same as carrying the past. Before going to bed, I sat at my desk one last time, the gavel resting near the lamp. I ran my hand over its smooth surface, remembering the day my grandfather first let me hold it. I could still hear him saying, "You'll know when to let go, Ava." Maybe that time had come. When the mail arrived the next morning, I found another envelope without a return address. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. I placed it in the same drawer as the others, unopened, undisturbed. Some truths no longer needed confirmation. That night the house was quiet. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. I turned off the light, letting the sound fill the room. For the first time in a long while, I didn't think about courtrooms or names and headlines. I thought about the kitchen, where Evelyn once hummed while baking cookies, about Henry, reading late into the night, about the kind of love that had no conditions, no expectations, only presence. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, bright and warm. I stood by the window, the garden glistening with dew, and whispered the same words that had carried me through everything justice always arrives. It just takes time. The call came early on a gray morning. I had just arrived at the courthouse, coffee in one hand, when my phone began to buzz. The number wasn't one I recognized, but I answered anyway, more out of habit than curiosity. "Judge Monroe," the voice said, low and hesitant. It took me a second to place it. "Eric Dawson." "I'm sorry to reach out again," he continued, "but I thought you'd want to know. Your mother passed away last night." I didn't move at first. The words hung in the air like something suspended, real, but not yet felt. When I asked quietly, "Around midnight," he said. "She'd been sick for a while. Liver failure. There were no next of kin listed, except you." For a long moment I couldn't answer. The courthouse around me kept moving, footsteps, murmurs, the sound of papers rustling, all of it far away. "Thank you for letting me know," I said finally. My voice was calm, almost too calm. "What happens next?" "She didn't have much left," Dawson said gently. "Her attorney mentioned a few personal effects and a letter addressed to you. It's being sent to your chambers." When the call ended, I stood in the hallway, still holding the phone, still clutching my coffee that had gone cold. My mother, the woman who'd spent most of her life pretending I didn't exist, was gone. I expected something to surface: grief, anger, even relief. But all that came was quiet. Later that day, a small brown envelope arrived at my office. Megan set it on my desk, unaware of what it was. I waited until the end of the day before opening it. Inside were two things: a faded photograph and a folded piece of stationery. The photo was of Evelyn, Henry, and me, taken in the backyard of the old Brookline house. I was maybe 5 years old, sitting on Henry's shoulders laughing. My mother must have taken it. On the back, in her looping handwriting, were 3 words, "For what it's worth." The letter was short, written on cheap-lined paper. "Ava," it began, "I've made more mistakes than anyone should be allowed to. I told myself they were for love, for survival, for family, but that was never true. You were the only good thing I ever did, and I walked away from it. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I kept that photo all these years. Not for them, for you." There was no signature, just a faint mark where the pen had pressed too hard and broken through the page. I sat there for a while, reading the words over and over, waiting for them to mean more than they did. Then I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the photo frame on my bookshelf. It didn't erase anything, but it didn't need to. Some closures arrive like whispers, not answers. The following week, I drove out to Hartford. The address Dawson had given me was a run-down apartment complex with peeling paint and narrow stairways. Her landlord met me outside the door. "Didn't have much," he said, handing me a small box. Inside were a few books, a broken watch, and an old hairbrush missing most of its bristles. Among them was a silver bracelet I hadn't seen since childhood. Evelyn's bracelet, the one with the tiny heart charm. I turned it over in my hand, wondering how it had found its way back to her after all those years. I thanked the landlord, left the key on the counter, and walked out without looking back. The air was sharp and cold, and for the first time I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The story that had started before I could walk had finally reached its last page. When I returned home, Daniel was waiting on my porch. He didn't say anything when I stepped out of the car, just opened his arms. I let the silence speak for us both. Later over coffee, I told him about the letter about the bracelet, about how strange it felt to lose someone I'd already lost long ago. He listened without interruption, then said quietly, "Maybe that was her way of showing up at the end." In the days that followed, I found myself thinking less about her and more about Evelyn and Henry, about the way they had chosen presence over perfection. Their kind of love didn't fade. It settled into the fabric of who I was. When I looked at the photo on my shelf, I didn't see loss anymore. I saw continuity. Spring came early that year. The garden outside my window bloomed with the tulips Evelyn had once planted. The colors were brighter than I remembered, red gold ivory pushing through the soil like small declarations of survival. On quiet mornings, I'd sit outside with my coffee, the air crisp and clean, and think about how life had unfolded exactly as it was meant to, even when it hadn't felt fair. One afternoon, Megan stopped by with a bouquet from the courthouse staff, small white lilies and a card that read simply, "Thinking of you." I thanked her and placed them on the kitchen table. She lingered by the doorway before saying, "Judge, you once told me the law shows people who they really are. I think it showed you too." Her words stayed with me. That evening, I walked into my grandfather's study, my study now, and looked around at the framed degrees, the shelves lined with casebooks, the gavel resting under soft light. I thought of the girl who once sat in that same chair coloring on scrap paper while her grandfather prepared for trial. I realized then that everything I had become, every choice, every strength had been shaped by people who showed up when others didn't. A week later, I drove to Mount Auburn Cemetery. The air smelled of wet grass and earth after rain. I knelt by the 2 headstones, brushing off the petals that had fallen from the trees above. "It's over now," I said softly. "All of it." I laid the silver bracelet beside Evelyn's grave, the heart charm catching a glint of sunlight. "She kept something that belonged to you. I think it's time it came home." As I stood, a breeze moved through the trees carrying the faint sound of birdsong. The sky had begun to clear, streaks of blue breaking through the gray. I stayed there until the light started to fade, the air cooling around me. When I finally turned to leave, the world felt different, not lighter exactly, but settled. Driving back through the winding roads toward the city, I passed the courthouse on the hill. The windows glowed with evening light, and for a moment I imagined my grandfather walking through those halls again, robe trailing behind him, steady and calm. I smiled. Justice had come not in a single verdict, but through the quiet endurance of time. When I got home, I placed the photograph on my mantel. The edges were worn now, but the image inside was still clear. Evelyn's hand on Henry's shoulder, both of them smiling, their eyes turned toward me. The picture had traveled through years of distance, through bitterness and regret, to find its way back here. Maybe that was what love looked like when it outlasted everything else. That night, I left the window open, the scent of spring drifting in with the cool breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck midnight, steady and sure. I thought of Henry's voice again, calm and unwavering. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about showing up. And for the first time, I realized I had finally lived that truth. The house was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that feels earned. The garden outside shimmered with the last traces of daylight, each tulip closing softly as the sun sank behind the trees. I stood by the window, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue, and thought about how much life could change without anyone noticing. Years had passed since that first courtroom, since the trial that tore open everything I thought family meant. Now what remained wasn't anger or grief, it was peace. Becoming a judge had taught me more about people than I ever expected. Every face that stood before me carried its own story, some burdened by mistakes, others by circumstance. But beneath them all was the same quiet need for fairness. I heard echoes of my grandfather's voice in every verdict, his calm reminder that justice wasn't about punishment. It was about understanding. I carried that with me every day, like an invisible compass. Megan had just been promoted to a new position across the state. On her last day, she stopped by my chambers, smiling the way she always did when she was both proud and nervous. "You were right," she said. "The law really does show people who they are, but it showed me who I want to be too." She hugged me before leaving, and when the door closed behind her, I felt the same bittersweet ache I'd once felt saying goodbye to my grandparents. Growth always asked for letting go. After she left, I walked to the bookshelf where the photograph sat, the one my mother had kept all those years. It had been through so much, yet somehow the colors hadn't faded. I could still see the sunlight on my grandmother's hair, the steady patience in my grandfather's eyes. I traced the edge of the frame and whispered a quiet thank you. They had taught me what love looks like when it stays. In the months that followed, I began spending less time in court and more time outside the city. I'd drive out to the small lake where my grandparents used to take me fishing when I was little. The air always smelled of pine and rain there, and the stillness made everything else feel small. One morning, as the sun broke through a thin layer of fog, I realized how far I'd come from the girl who once waited for parents who never came home. I had stopped waiting. I had built something lasting with truth, with presence, with choice. When I retired a few years later, the ceremony was simple. Daniel sat in the front row, clapping quietly as my name was called. Afterward, we walked out together into the crisp autumn air. "You did it?" he said, smiling. "You really did everything you set out to do." I looked up at the courthouse behind us, the sunlight glinting off its marble steps, and shook my head softly. "No," I said. "We did what we were meant to." He laughed. "You're still as humble as ever." "Not humble," I said, "just grateful." That evening I drove straight to Mount Auburn Cemetery. The air was cool, the wind carrying the smell of rain. I knelt between their graves again, tracing the engraved names with my fingertips. "It's been a long road," I said quietly, "but I think you'd be proud of how it turned out." I placed a single tulip between the headstones, its petals trembling in the breeze. "You were right, Grandpa. Justice takes time, but it always arrives." As I stood, a soft gust of wind moved through the trees, scattering a few leaves across the path. I smiled, feeling the weight in my chest ease the way it always did here. I walked back toward the car, the sound of my footsteps steady against the gravel. Behind me, the sun dipped low, and the sky glowed the same soft amber I remembered from childhood evenings in their backyard. At home, I brewed a pot of tea and sat by the window. The house was still the garden alive beneath the stars. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of the city life carrying on as it always had. I thought about the lessons that had carried me this far, the ones that never made it into any courtroom, that family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up. That strength doesn't come from fighting louder, but from standing steady when it matters most. And that sometimes the hardest kind of justice isn't the kind you win in court, it's the kind you make for yourself when no one else will. I took a slow breath, letting it fill the quiet. Then I looked out toward the night sky and whispered, "We made it." If you've ever had to rebuild yourself after being hurt by the people who should have loved you most, know this. You're not alone. Justice doesn't always come fast, but it comes. Sometimes through others, sometimes through time, and sometimes through you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it spoke to you in some way, share it with someone who might need to hear that healing is possible too. And remember, peace doesn't mean forgetting. It means finally being free.